Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'll be sharing some horror stories to help you relax and fall asleep. This is my very first video, so if you enjoy it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. I'd also love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment below and let me know. Now sit back, relax, and let's dive into some chilling tales. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago, back when I was still living in Pittsburgh. I had just moved into a new apartment in the Shadyside area, which, for those who don't know, is a nice, quiet neighborhood not far from the city center. I was fresh out of college and working my first real job. The apartment was small, just a one-bedroom place, but it was my own, and I loved having my own space. At the time, I was working pretty long hours. My job involved a lot of late nights and occasional weekends, so I wasn't home much. The apartment complex I lived in was one of those older brick buildings, kind that probably used to be really upscale in the 1950s, but had since become just another average place. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and in a good area, so I couldn't complain. The weird stuff started happening about a month after I moved in. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things that didn't seem right. I'd come home from work and find the windows slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed them before leaving. Or I'd find the kitchen cabinet door open that I didn't remember leaving open. I figured I was just tired and not paying attention, so I didn't think much of it at first. One night though, things started to get a little more unsettling. I had come home late after working on a big project, exhausted and ready to crash. I was getting ready for bed when I noticed something weird. One of my dining room chairs was pulled away from the table, almost like someone had been sitting there. I always pushed them in, because honestly, I'm a bit of a neat freak. I didn't think much of it at the time, just chalked it up to maybe bumping the chair earlier in the day. The next morning, though, the same chair was pulled out again. I remember standing there in the kitchen, staring at it, wondering if I was just losing my mind. I didn't recall pulling it out, and I definitely hadn't used the dining table that morning. Still, I convinced myself that maybe I had absent-mindedly bumped it again while rushing to get out the door. Things went on like that for a few more weeks. Little stuff like the chair being moved or finding items in slightly different places than I had left them. I was working long hours, so I figured I was just tired and making mistakes. But it was around this time that I started to notice other things that were harder to explain. One night I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard something. It was a faint sound, like the soft creak of a floorboard. My apartment had old hardwood floors that creaked a little, so it wasn't unusual. But this creak came from the living room, just outside my bedroom door. I froze, straining to hear more. It was silent for a while, but then I heard it again. Another faint creak, like someone was carefully stepping across the floor. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I stayed completely still, listening. I knew it could just be the building settling, but this felt different. I sat up in bed, trying to make out any more sounds. After a few minutes, everything went quiet again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me and managed to fall asleep. A few nights later, I was woken up by the same sound. Soft, deliberate creaking, like footsteps in the living room. This time, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My heart was racing as I slowly opened the bedroom door and shined the light into the living room. Nothing. The place was empty, just like it always was. I checked the windows and the front door to make sure they were locked, and everything was secure. I didn't sleep much that night. Things started to escalate after that. One night, I came home from work, and my front door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning, and I always double-checked before I left. My stomach dropped when I saw the door slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was completely silent, and everything looked normal. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone being there. I convinced myself that I must have forgotten to lock the door, even though I knew that wasn't likely. I wasn't a particularly forgetful person, especially about stuff like that. Still, I let it go and moved on. But the strange occurrences continued. I'd come home and find things moved around. Small stuff like a dish on the counter that I hadn't used, or my keys not where I left them. I even started taking pictures of the apartment before leaving in the morning, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I'd compare the pictures when I got home, and sometimes things were just slightly different. Like a chair was moved an inch or something, was on the floor that hadn't been there before. The breaking point came one night when I was lying in bed. I had gotten home late again, completely exhausted, and was trying to fall asleep. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, soft creaking in the living room. I bolted upright, listening intently. This time, the creaking was steady, like someone was walking slowly around the room. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was 2:45 a.m. I sat in bed, clutching my phone and trying to figure out what to do. The creaking continued, and it was getting closer, like whoever or whatever it was moving toward my bedroom. My throat went dry as I stared at the closed bedroom door. I was too terrified to move, too scared to even breathe. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob to my bedroom rattled just slightly, like someone was testing it. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and called 911. I whispered to the operator, telling them someone was in my apartment, and they said they were sending officers immediately. I crouched by the bed, shaking, waiting for what felt like forever. The rattling stopped, and everything went silent again. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the operator try to calm me down, but I couldn't focus. My eyes were locked on the bedroom door, waiting for it to burst open at any second. A few minutes later, I heard a loud knock on the front door. "Police?" they called. I stayed frozen for a second, not sure if I should even move. But the operator confirmed they were outside, and I slowly crept out of the bedroom. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand, but I managed to make it to the front door and open it. 2 officers stood in the hallway, and I practically collapsed with relief. They came inside and searched the entire apartment, but there was no sign of anyone. The windows were locked from the inside, and the front door hadn't been tampered with. They checked every corner, every closet, but found nothing. I told them about the noises and the doorknob rattling, but they didn't seem convinced. They said it was possible that I had imagined it, maybe a dream or sleep paralysis. I tried to argue, but I could tell they weren't taking me seriously. They suggested I get better locks and maybe a security system, and left after giving me their card. I felt a mixture of frustration and fear as I watched them leave. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been in my apartment, I was sure of it. But without any evidence, what could I do? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every little sound making me jump. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought the heaviest duty locks I could find. I even ordered a security camera to install by the front door. I didn't feel safe in that apartment anymore, but I couldn't afford to break my lease, so I just tried to make the best of it. For the next few weeks, things seemed to go back to normal. No more noises, no more stuff out of place. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it had all just been a series of weird coincidences, or maybe someone messing with me that had finally given up. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Then, one morning, I woke up and found something that made my heart stop. There, on my kitchen counter, was a note. It wasn't anything long or threatening, just a single line, written in shaky handwriting. "I've been watching." I felt like I was going to throw up. I knew for sure now that someone had been in my apartment and they had left me that note. I grabbed my phone and called the police again. But when they came, there was nothing they could do. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. That was the last straw for me. I didn't care about breaking the lease anymore. I packed up my things and moved out that same week. I never went back to that apartment, and I haven't set foot in Shadyside since. I don't know who was in my apartment or how they were getting in, but I know it wasn't my imagination. To this day, I still get paranoid in my own home, double and triple checking the locks, installing cameras, and making sure nothing is out of place. Whatever it was, whoever it was, they had been in my space, watching, and I'll never forget the way that note made me feel. I've told a few people about this, but most of them just brush it off as a creepy coincidence or say I must have been stressed from work and imagining things. But I know what happened, and it still scares the hell out of me. It was summer, and I had just gotten out of college. I didn't have much lined up, just a part-time job at a hardware store back in my hometown. It was one of those small Midwestern towns in Illinois, where everyone knows everyone, and things don't really change. But after spending time in the city for school, coming back felt kind of suffocating. That's probably why I was always looking for excuses to get out, to explore. One weekend, I decided to take a road trip. Nothing fancy or far, just to Chicago, which was about a couple of hours away. It wasn't a special plan, just an urge to get out of town for a bit. I loaded up my car, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road. The weather was perfect. Sunny with a slight breeze, and the roads were mostly empty. Just the occasional truck or SUV speeding past. About an hour into the drive, I noticed my gas gauge was lower than I thought. I pulled off the highway near a small town that I'd never heard of. It wasn't even marked well on the map, just a cluster of streets that didn't seem to have much going on. The gas station was one of those old-school places, with faded signs and a single pump. It was the kind of place where they had a handwritten note on the door that said they were on lunch break, and the clerk wouldn't be back for another 15 minutes. So, I waited. There was a small diner across the street, and it looked decent enough. I figured I could grab something to eat while I waited for the gas station attendant to return. The place was empty, except for an older couple sitting in the corner, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working there for decades. I sat at the counter, ordered a sandwich, and just tried to relax. After being on the road for a while, it felt good to sit down. As I ate, I noticed that the older couple was staring at me. It wasn't a friendly or curious stare, more like a cold, assessing look. It made me uncomfortable, so I tried not to make eye contact and just focused on my food. I finished up quickly and left a tip, then headed back to the gas station. When I got there, the attendant still wasn't back, but the station doors were unlocked. It seemed weird, but I figured maybe they had a self-pay system or something. I went inside, but there was no one at the counter. The place was quiet, too quiet. I called out, but no one responded. The whole vibe of the place was off, and I just wanted to get back on the road. I filled up my tank and left some cash on the counter, hoping the attendant would find it when they got back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the weird feeling the town had given me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but something just didn't feel right. I got back on the highway and continued toward Chicago, trying to brush it off. The drive was uneventful after that, and I spent the next couple of days in the city just hanging out, visiting some friends, and doing touristy stuff. On the last day of the trip, I decided to take a different route back home, just for a change of scenery. I wasn't in a rush, so I thought it might be nice to avoid the main highways and take some back roads. About halfway through the drive, I found myself on a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense forest. It wasn't marked on my map, but I checked earlier, and I knew it was heading in the right direction, so I kept going. The trees were thick, and the road was isolated, no cars in sight for miles. It was peaceful at first, but after a while it started to feel a little too isolated. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. I was starting to get tired, and my phone didn't have a signal out there. After driving for what felt like ages without seeing any signs of life, I finally saw a small turnoff with a dirt road, leading to what looked like a rest stop. There was a beat-up sign, barely legible, that said, "Welcome Center," or something like that. I figured I'd stop there for a bit, stretch my legs, and check the map again to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. When I pulled in, the place was completely deserted. There was a small building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, and a couple of rusty picnic tables scattered around. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but I didn't want to keep driving without checking where I was. I parked the car and got out, walking toward the building. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. Inside it was dark and smelled damp, like the place had been abandoned for a while. There was an old bulletin board on the wall, covered in faded flyers and maps that were barely readable. I found a map of the area, but it didn't seem to match the roads I'd been on. The whole thing was confusing, and I started to feel like maybe I should just get back in the car and keep driving. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound, faint but unmistakable. It was a shuffling noise, like footsteps coming from the back of the building. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to convince myself it was probably an animal or just the wind playing tricks. Still, I quickened my pace as I headed back to the car. Just as I reached the door, I heard it again, louder this time. Something or someone was definitely moving behind the building. I didn't wait around to figure out what it was. I yanked open the car door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled as I tried to get the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered for a second before finally starting, and I floored it out of there. The dirt road kicking up behind me in a cloud. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror. There was no one behind me, but I kept driving faster anyway, not wanting to take any chances. The sun had almost completely set by now, and the forest around me was getting darker by the minute. I just wanted to be back on the main road, back where there were other people. I drove for what felt like an hour, maybe more, before I finally saw another car in the distance. It was parked on the side of the road, a little too far ahead for me to make out the details. As I got closer, I noticed the car had its hazard lights on, and there was a figure standing next to it, waving. My first instinct was to slow down, but something in my gut told me not to. The figure was wearing dark clothing, and I couldn't see their face clearly in the dim light. They were standing a little too far from the car, almost like they were trying to lure someone closer. I slowed down just enough to get a better look, and that's when I noticed something even more unsettling. The driver's side door of the car was wide open, but there was no one else inside. No movement, no sign of anyone in trouble. Just this lone figure, standing on the side of the road, waving like they were expecting me to stop. I don't know what it was, but something about the whole situation felt wrong, like a trap. I didn't stop. Instead, I sped up and swerved around the car, glancing in my side mirror as I passed. The figure didn't try to follow or wave me down again. They just stood there, watching, as I drove away. Once I was far enough down the road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My mind was racing with what could have happened back there. Maybe the person really needed help, but everything about it seemed off. It was too late, too isolated, and too coincidental after what had just happened at the rest stop. I kept driving for a while longer until I finally hit a small town. It wasn't the same town where I had stopped for gas earlier, but it had a similar feel, quiet, not much going on. I pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked near the front entrance. This time, there were other people around, a few cars filling up, and the store inside was open with bright fluorescent lights shining through the windows. I felt a little safer here. I went inside, grabbed a bottle of water, and asked the clerk for directions back to the highway. He pointed me in the right direction, and I thanked him, feeling relieved to be around other people again. I took my time in the gas station, letting myself calm down before getting back in the car. Eventually, I got back on the road and made it home, without any other strange encounters. But the entire drive, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure on the side of the road, or the noises I'd heard at the rest stop. It all felt too weird, like I'd narrowly avoided something dangerous, but I couldn't quite figure out what it was. For weeks after, I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if I'd overreacted or if something was really wrong. Part of me thought I should have called someone, maybe the police, to report the car or the person by the side of the road. But then again, what would I have said? That someone was standing by their car late at night, and I didn't like the way it felt. It just didn't seem like something anyone would take seriously. Life went back to normal after that. I kept working at the hardware store, hanging out with friends, and eventually found a full-time job in the city. But every now and then, especially when I'm driving alone at night, I think about that trip, about the way the town felt off, about the footsteps behind the building, and about the figure on the side of the road. I don't know if it was just a series of coincidences or if I really did avoid something bad happening that day. I've never really talked about this before, mostly because I didn't know what to make of it at the time, and honestly, it still feels too weird to fully process. But every now and then, it comes back to me, and I wonder what could have happened if things had gone a little differently. This was about 4 years ago, when I was still living in Portland, Oregon. I had just gone through a rough breakup and was in a phase where I wanted to do anything but sit around my apartment, dwelling on everything. I figured the best way to get out of my head was to just stay busy, so I started going on long hikes every weekend. Portland has tons of great trails nearby, and I've always liked being out in nature, so it became my go-to way to clear my mind. One Saturday, I decided to go for a hike in the Columbia River Gorge, which is about 40 minutes from downtown Portland. The gorge is this beautiful stretch of land along the Columbia River, with steep cliffs, waterfalls, and dense forests. There are a ton of trails, but I picked one I hadn't been on before, Eagle Creek. I'd heard good things about it, and it was supposed to have some great views. I got to the trailhead around 10 a.m. There were a few cars in the parking lot, but it wasn't crowded. It was early spring, so the weather was cool but not cold. Perfect for a long hike. I had packed some snacks and water, put on my hiking boots, and set off down the trail. The first part of the hike was great. The trail followed the creek, winding through the forest, with the sound of running water keeping me company. I passed a few other hikers along the way. Couples, families, the usual mix. But after about an hour, the trail started to get a little more rugged, and the number of people thinned out. I didn't mind. In fact, I kind of liked it. I was out there to get away from everything, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. After a couple of hours, I reached a split in the trail. One path continued along the creek, but the other veered off and started to climb up into the hills. There wasn't a sign, but I had checked the map earlier and I figured the uphill path would lead to a better viewpoint, so I took it. The climb was steep, but manageable, and after another 30 minutes or so, I reached a ridge with an amazing view of the gorge. The river stretched out below, with the cliffs rising up on either side. It was breathtaking, and for a moment I just stood there, taking it all in. That's when I noticed the cabin. At first I thought I was imagining things. I was pretty far up, and I didn't expect to see any structures out here, but there it was. An old, run-down cabin, maybe a couple 100 feet off the trail, nestled in the trees. It was half hidden by the brush, and if I hadn't been looking in that direction, I probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. I don't know why, but something about it caught my attention. It looked abandoned, with the roof sagging and the windows boarded up. The wood was weathered and grey, like it had been sitting there for decades. I was curious, and since I wasn't in a hurry, I decided to check it out. The path down to the cabin wasn't really a path at all, just a mess of overgrown bushes and fallen branches. I had to push through the brush, and the closer I got, the more I realized just how old the cabin was. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years, maybe even longer. The front door was hanging off its hinges, and there was graffiti on the walls, but it was faded, like whoever had done it hadn't been around in a long time. I stepped up to the porch, which creaked under my weight, and peeked inside. The place was trashed, broken furniture, dirt, and leaves scattered all over the floor. There were a few old cans and bottles lying around, but nothing that suggested anyone had been living there recently. I stepped inside just out of curiosity, looking around at the remnants of whatever life had been here before. There wasn't much to see, just a small main room and what looked like a bedroom in the back, though the door to that room was shut. I don't know why, but I got this weird feeling in my stomach when I saw that door. It was closed, but it didn't look like it had been locked or anything. I had this sudden urge to leave, like I shouldn't be there anymore. I chalked it up to just feeling creeped out by the whole abandoned cabin in the woods thing. I took a quick picture of the place on my phone, just as a little keepsake of the hike, and turned to leave. As I was heading back up to the trail, I heard something, a faint rustling in the bushes behind the cabin. I stopped for a second, listening. It could have been an animal. There were plenty of deer in the area, and maybe a bear or two, though they were rare. Still, it was enough to make me quicken my pace. I scrambled back up to the ridge and got back on the trail. The rest of the hike felt a little off after that. I couldn't shake this sense of unease, like I wasn't alone. I didn't hear anything else, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing, just the quiet sound of the wind in the trees and the distant rush of the river below. By the time I made it back to the parking lot, the sun was starting to set. The cars I had seen earlier were gone, and mine was the only one left. The whole place felt eerily quiet. I got into my car and headed home, trying to shake the weird feeling that had settled over me since I found the cabin. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept looking at the picture I had taken, zooming in on the cabin to see if I could notice anything I hadn't seen while I was there. The picture was blurry, probably because I had been moving when I took it, but I could still make out the basic shape of the cabin and the trees surrounding it. That night I did a little digging online to see if I could find out anything about the cabin. It didn't take long to find a few mentions of abandoned buildings in the gorge, mostly old logging cabins or homesteads that had been left behind when the area became a protected wilderness. Some hikers had posted about finding similar cabins, though none of them seemed to match the one I had seen. I went back to my normal routine after that: work, occasional hikes, hanging out with friends. But every now and then I'd find myself thinking about that cabin, wondering what was behind that closed door. I even thought about going back once or twice just to satisfy my curiosity, but something kept me from doing it. Maybe it was just the general creepiness of the place, or maybe it was something more instinctual, telling me not to go poking around where I didn't belong. A couple of months went by and the cabin faded to the back of my mind. Then, one day, I was scrolling through the local news when a headline caught my eye: "Hiker found dead in Columbia River Gorge." My heart sank as I clicked on the article. The hiker had been a man in his mid-30s, and his body had been found off one of the more remote trails in the area. The article didn't go into much detail, but it mentioned that foul play hadn't been ruled out. That was enough to make me think about the cabin again. I couldn't help but wonder if it was on the same trail or if it was just a coincidence. I looked up the trail name and my stomach dropped. It was Eagle Creek, the same trail I had been on. I didn't know what to make of it. People died in the wilderness sometimes, accidents happened, but this felt too close to home. I started to wonder if the hiker had found the same cabin I had, and if maybe something had happened to him there. It was a wild thought, and probably just my mind trying to connect dots that weren't there. But I couldn't shake it. I didn't go back to Eagle Creek after that. In fact, I stopped hiking in the gorge altogether. I still went on hikes, but I stuck to the more popular trails, the ones where I knew there would be other people around. I didn't want to end up like that hiker, wandering too far off the beaten path and into something I couldn't handle. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled across that afternoon in the woods. Maybe it was just an old abandoned cabin, nothing more. Maybe I spooked myself for no reason. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that door, the one that was shut. What if I had opened it? What would I have found? I'll never know, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I don't really know how to start this, but I guess I'll just get into it. This happened a few years ago, and I still can't make sense of it. I try not to think about it too much, but every once in a while something will remind me, and all those feelings come rushing back. It was late summer, maybe early fall. I was living in Denver at the time, working as a freelance graphic designer, which meant I had a pretty flexible schedule. One of the perks was that I could work from anywhere, so I'd occasionally take a few days off and get out of the city to clear my head. Colorado has a lot of great spots for camping, and I've always been into the outdoors. I'd been on a couple of solo camping trips before, but nothing too far off the grid. Mostly well-known campsites where I wasn't too isolated. But this time I wanted something different. A friend of mine had mentioned a place called Buffalo Peaks Wilderness. It's about 2 hours from Denver, near the town of Fairplay. It's a little more remote than other areas, but not so much that it felt dangerous. I looked it up and found a few trails that weren't too crowded. Perfect for what I was looking for. A peaceful few days to myself, away from work and city life. I packed up my car and headed out one Friday morning, planning to camp until Sunday. The drive out there was beautiful, with the mountains coming into view as I got further from the city. By the time I arrived, it was early afternoon. The trailhead was nearly empty, just one other car parked there, but that didn't bother me. I was looking forward to some solitude. I hiked for a few hours, making my way through dense pine trees and open meadows. The trail was well maintained, but rugged enough to feel like I was really out in nature. I found a good spot to set up camp near a small creek, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be disturbed, but close enough to find my way back easily. After setting up my tent, I sat by the creek, enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the water trickling over rocks and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for. That night I made a small fire, cooked some dinner, and settled in for the night. It was chilly but comfortable, and I drifted off to sleep quickly. The first night passed without any issues. I woke up the next morning, made some coffee, and spent most of the day exploring the area. I didn't see anyone else the entire time, which was a little odd, but I figured most people would be on the more popular trails. I hiked for a few hours, checked out some cool rock formations, and then headed back to camp as the sun started to set. That night, things started to get strange. I was lying in my tent, trying to fall asleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps. They were faint, and at first I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or something. I didn't think much of it and tried to ignore it, but the footsteps didn't go away. They seemed to be getting closer. I sat up, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, not like the scurrying of an animal. They stopped just outside my tent. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was probably just my imagination. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and it didn't make sense that someone would be out here in the middle of nowhere. I didn't hear anything else for a while, so I laid back down, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a faint rustling sound. It was coming from the direction of my backpack, which I'd left outside the tent, a few feet away from the entrance. I froze. I hadn't left any food in the backpack, so it didn't make sense that an animal would be interested in it. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. I shined the light toward the backpack, but there was nothing there, just the bag, sitting where I'd left it. I stayed there for a few minutes, scanning the area with my flashlight, but everything was still. No movement, no sounds. I eventually convinced myself that maybe it had been the wind, or some small animal rustling through the leaves. I zipped up the tent and lay back down, but it took me a while to fall asleep after that. The next morning I found my backpack exactly where it had been, untouched. There were no signs of animals or anything out of the ordinary. I figured I was just letting my mind get the best of me. I spent the day hiking again, exploring further up the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but the trail was as empty as it had been the day before. That evening, I got back to camp a little earlier. I wanted to get the fire going and cook dinner before it got too dark. As I was gathering wood, I noticed something strange. There was a pile of rocks near the edge of my camp, stacked up in a neat little tower. It hadn't been there before. I stood there, staring at it for a minute, trying to figure out how it got there. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, and there was no reason for a random pile of rocks to suddenly appear. I started to feel uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it had been there the whole time and I just hadn't noticed. I finished gathering wood and made dinner, but I couldn't stop thinking about the rocks. After I ate, I went back over to the pile, inspecting it more closely. It wasn't big, maybe a foot tall, but the rocks were stacked too carefully for it to be accidental. Someone had definitely been here. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound had me on edge. At one point I heard footsteps again, but this time they were more distant, coming from further up the trail. I tried to tell myself it was just another hiker, but it didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone else the entire trip, and it was the middle of the night. Who would be out here at this hour? I lay there in my tent, wide awake until the sun finally started to rise. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up my gear and headed back toward the trailhead. I wasn't planning on sticking around for a third night. Something didn't feel right, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. As I hiked back, I kept checking behind me, feeling more and more uneasy with every step. I still hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often I'd stop and listen, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was relieved to see my car still parked where I'd left it. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, sitting on the hood of my car, was another stack of rocks, just like the one I'd found at my campsite. I stood there staring at the rocks, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been out here, following me, watching me. But why? And how had they gotten so close without me noticing? I didn't stick around to find out. I tossed my gear in the back seat, jumped in the car, and got the hell out of there. As I drove back toward Denver, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty, and I didn't see another car the entire drive back. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. I went over everything in my head, trying to figure out who could have been out there with me. But no matter how many times I replayed it, I couldn't come up with an answer that made sense. I haven't been back to Buffalo Peaks since. I still go camping sometimes, but I stick to more popular spots where there are other people around. I don't think I could handle another solo trip after that. Looking back, I'm not sure if I was in any real danger or if it was just someone messing with me. But either way, it was enough to make me rethink camping alone. The thought of someone creeping around my camp, watching me without my knowing, still gives me chills. I try not to let it get to me, but every once in a while I'll find myself thinking about those rocks, perfectly stacked, and I wonder, who was out there? And what did they want? That's the part that scares me the most. I'll probably never know. I've never really told anyone this story in detail, mostly because it still creeps me out to think about. It's one of those things that I wish I could forget, but every now and then it pops back into my head, especially when I'm alone at night. I'm writing it down here because maybe it'll help me finally get past it. This happened a few years ago when I was living in San Diego. I had just graduated from college and was working at a small marketing agency downtown. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills, and I had my weekends free to explore. San Diego is a great city for outdoor activities, and I'd often spend my free time at the beach or hiking in the surrounding hills. One weekend I decided to head out for a hike at Cuyamaca Rancho State Park. It's about an hour's drive from the city up in the mountains. The area is known for its scenic trails, with lots of dense forest and wide open meadows. I'd been there a couple of times with friends, but this time I was going solo. I'd had a stressful week at work and just wanted some time to myself to unwind. I left early Saturday morning to avoid the crowds and get a full day of hiking in. The drive up was peaceful, clear skies, not much traffic, and I got to the park around 9 a.m. There were only a few cars in the parking lot when I arrived, which was perfect. I wanted to avoid people as much as possible. I had planned out a route that would take me on a loop, about 10 miles total, with a mix of wooded trails and open areas. It wasn't a difficult hike, but long enough to give me that feeling of being away from everything. I had my backpack with the usual supplies, water, snacks, a small first aid kit, and I set off on the trail. The first few hours were great. I barely saw anyone else, just a couple of hikers early on who were heading back toward the parking lot. After a while, I didn't see anyone at all. It was just me and the trail, surrounded by trees and the sound of birds and the wind rustling through the branches. It was exactly what I needed. Around noon, I reached a clearing that opened up into a wide meadow. There was a small hill in the distance, and I could see what looked like a fire lookout tower on top. I hadn't planned to go that way, but it seemed like a good spot to stop for lunch and take in the view. The trail leading to the tower was barely noticeable, just a narrow path cutting through the tall grass. It didn't look like many people went up that way. I followed the path up the hill, which took about 20 minutes. The higher I climbed, the better the view got, and by the time I reached the top, I could see for miles in every direction. The tower was old and rusted, but still standing. There was a small wooden platform at the top, maybe 20 feet high, with a ladder leading up to it. I figured it would be a good spot to sit and eat, so I climbed up. When I got to the top, the view was even more incredible. I could see the mountains stretching out to the east and the city far off in the distance to the west. It was completely silent up there. No sounds of people, just the wind and the occasional distant bird call. I sat down, pulled out my sandwich, and started to eat. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, maybe a quarter mile from the tower, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the meadow, right where the trees started. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, but they were standing completely still, just staring in my direction. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure was too far away to make out any details. They weren't moving at all, which struck me as odd. I figured they were just resting, maybe looking at the tower or the view. But something about the way they were standing there didn't feel right. Most people, when they stop to take in a view or rest, will shift their weight or move around a bit. But this person was motionless. I tried to ignore it and went back to my lunch, but every few minutes I'd glance back in their direction, and they were still there, not moving. After about 10 minutes, I started to get uncomfortable. It didn't make sense for someone to just stand there like that. I packed up my stuff and decided to head back down the trail. I figured I'd take a different route back to the parking lot, avoiding the meadow just in case. As I climbed down the ladder, I glanced over my shoulder again, and the figure was gone. I felt a wave of relief, thinking maybe they had finally moved on, but something still didn't sit right with me. I picked up the pace, walking quickly down the hill and back toward the main trail. As I reached the tree line, I heard a noise behind me. a faint rustling, like something moving through the grass. I stopped and turned around, but there was nothing there. The meadow was empty. I stood there for a moment listening, but the noise had stopped. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal, and I kept walking. I made it back to the main trail and started heading toward the parking lot. The uneasiness I'd felt at the tower hadn't gone away, but I tried to push it out of my mind. It was the middle of the day, and I was in a state park. There was no reason to feel scared. About half an hour later, as I was making my way through a particularly dense section of forest, I heard the noise again, the rustling, but this time it was closer, coming from behind me. I stopped and turned around, but once again, there was nothing there. Just trees and the trail behind me. I stood there for a minute, heart pounding, listening. The rustling started again, this time from off the trail deeper in the woods. It was faint, but it was definitely there. I felt my stomach tighten, and I quickly turned back around and started walking faster. I didn't want to run, but I was getting close. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 50 feet ahead of me, standing in the middle of the trail, was the same figure I had seen at the edge of the meadow. They were just standing there, facing me, completely still. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but it was definitely the same person. I stopped dead in my tracks. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I hadn't seen anyone else for hours, and I had no idea who this person was or what they wanted. They didn't move, just stood there, blocking the trail. I considered turning around and going back the way I came, but the thought of heading back toward the meadow, where I'd heard the rustling, made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go back into the trees, but I didn't want to move forward either. I was stuck. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, me and this figure, facing each other on the trail. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands sweating. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked off the trail, disappearing into the trees. They didn't say anything, didn't make any noise, just walked into the woods like they belonged there. I didn't wait around to see if they would come back. As soon as they were out of sight, I bolted down the trail, running as fast as I could. My legs were shaking and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure behind me, but the trail was empty. I ran for what felt like miles, not stopping until I could see the parking lot through the trees. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but the road was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was back in San Diego. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I kept replaying the moment on the trail, trying to make sense of it. Who was that person? Why were they following me? And what would have happened if I had stayed on the trail instead of running? I never went back to Cuyamaca Rancho State Park after that. I still go hiking sometimes, but I stick to the busier trails now, places where there are always other people around. I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly avoided something bad that day, and I'm not eager to push my luck. Every so often I'll talk to other hikers, and a few have mentioned feeling uneasy in certain places. But I've never heard anyone describe anything like what I experienced. Maybe it was just a random person out for a hike, or maybe it was something else. I'll never know for sure. And honestly, I'm okay with that. This happened a couple of years ago when I was still living in Houston. I don't think about it much anymore, but every now and then, something will trigger a memory and it all comes rushing back. I haven't really told many people because I'm not sure anyone would believe me, and even when I tell the story to myself in my head, it just sounds too bizarre. But it happened, and writing it down might help me get it off my chest. At the time, I had just moved into a new apartment in the Montrose area. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small older building that had probably been built in the 70s or 80s. It had charm though, and I liked the neighborhood. I'd always loved Montrose for its artsy vibe and the cool little bars and cafes, so I was excited to finally live there. I'd been in the apartment for a couple of months when the summer heat really started to kick in. If you've ever lived in Houston, you know how brutal the heat can be. Sticky, humid, and relentless. My air conditioner was old and struggled to keep the place cool. So most nights I found myself sitting on my small balcony with a cold drink, trying to catch any breeze that might blow through. The balcony faced a narrow alleyway between my building and the next one over. It wasn't much of a view, just the side of the neighboring apartment building and the dumpsters below, but it was peaceful enough at night. The alley wasn't lit very well, just one flickering streetlight at the far end. But I didn't mind. The dim lighting kept things quiet, and it was rare to see anyone back there. One night I was out on the balcony as usual, enjoying the cooler evening air. It was probably around 10 or 11 p.m., and I was just winding down after a long day at work. I was scrolling through my phone, half paying attention to the alley below, when I heard the sound of something scraping against the ground. I glanced up, expecting to see someone throwing out trash, or maybe a stray cat rummaging around, but there was nothing. The alley was empty, just like always. I figured it was just the wind or some small animal, and went back to my phone. A few minutes later, I heard it again. The same scraping noise, but this time it was louder, closer. I stood up and leaned over the railing, trying to get a better look. There was still no one there, but the sound was definitely coming from the alley. I stared down at the dumpsters, expecting to see something moving around, but everything was still. I sat back down, telling myself it was nothing. Probably a raccoon or something. I stayed out there for another 20 minutes or so before calling it a night and heading inside. The next evening I was back out on the balcony, this time with a beer in hand, just relaxing. It was quiet again, the usual hum of distant traffic and the occasional sound of people talking or laughing somewhere in the distance. After a while I heard the scraping noise again, but this time it was different, fainter, like it was coming from further down the alley. I stood up and looked over the railing, scanning the narrow passageway. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something move. It was at the far end of the alley, near the streetlight. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. There was a figure standing just outside the circle of light, too far away to see clearly. They were facing the wall of the neighboring building, standing completely still. I watched for a minute, waiting to see what they would do, but they didn't move. It was weird, like they were just standing there, staring at the wall. I thought about calling out to them, asking if they were okay, but something about the way they were standing there stopped me. It didn't feel right. After a few more seconds, the figure turned and slowly walked out of the alley, disappearing around the corner. I stood there for a minute, feeling uneasy, but not sure why. It wasn't that unusual to see people in the alley. Sometimes residents would take a shortcut through there, or someone would use it to walk their dog. But this felt different. Something about the way they had been standing so still, facing the wall. It just didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off and went back inside. The next day, I told myself it was nothing, just some random person who had stopped to tie their shoe or look at their phone. I didn't go out on the balcony that night, but the thought of that figure kept creeping into my mind. It wasn't like me to get spooked easily, but something about it bothered me. A few days later, I was back on the balcony again, trying to enjoy the evening. It was a little later this time, maybe around midnight. I hadn't heard the scraping sound again, and I was starting to feel a little silly for being so freaked out by what was probably just a normal person doing something completely innocent. I sat there for a while, finishing my beer, when I heard something. This time it wasn't the scraping noise. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the alley below. My heart started to race a little as I stood up and leaned over the railing again. The alley was dark, but I could see a figure walking slowly toward the dumpsters. They weren't moving quickly, just kind of strolling. But something about the way they were walking made my skin crawl. I couldn't see their face. The alley was too dark, but they were moving with this strange, almost mechanical precision. I watched as they stopped next to the dumpsters, standing completely still. They were facing the wall again, just like the figure I had seen a few nights before. I don't know why, but I couldn't take my eyes off them. I felt frozen, like I was waiting for them to do something, but they just stood there. After what felt like forever, the figure slowly turned and looked up in my direction. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were looking right at me. My stomach dropped, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed away from the railing and quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. I felt ridiculous for being so scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I peeked out the window, but the alley was empty again. The figure was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump, and I kept getting up to check the window, but the alley stayed quiet. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever that was had been watching me. The next day, I avoided the balcony altogether. I went about my day as usual, went to work, came home, and tried to relax. But I kept thinking about the figure in the alley. I didn't know if it was the same person I had seen before, but something about the way they had looked up at me, the way they had just stood there, it was unsettling. A few days later, I was getting ready for bed when I heard the noise outside. It was faint but distinct, the same scraping sound I had heard before. I froze, listening. The sound was coming from the alley again. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. I walked over to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed movement near the dumpsters. The figure was back, but this time they weren't standing still. They were crouched down next to the wall, doing something, scraping at the ground with their hands. I couldn't tell what they were doing, but it looked like they were digging or scratching at something. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched, not sure what to do. I wanted to call the police, but I felt stupid. What would I say? There was a person digging in the alley? That didn't sound like much of an emergency. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching as the figure continued to scrape at the ground. After a few minutes, they stood up, brushed off their hands, and slowly walked away, disappearing around the corner again. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I went down to the alley to see if I could figure out what the person had been doing. When I got to the spot where they had been crouching, I saw it. A small hole in the ground, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It wasn't deep, just a shallow scrape in the dirt, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I filled the hole with dirt and left the alley, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something wasn't right. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever that was would be back. I never saw the figure again after that, but I moved out of the apartment a few months later. It wasn't just because of the alley, but that experience definitely played a part. I still wonder who that person was and what they were doing in the alley that night. Maybe it was nothing, just some weirdo wandering around. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about the way they looked up at me, and I can't help but feel like they knew exactly what they were doing. I guess I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's for the best. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm a pretty rational person, and I've always thought there's an explanation for everything if you look hard enough. But something happened to me a few years ago that I still can't explain. It wasn't anything supernatural or out of this world, just terrifying in a way that sticks with you. I think about it sometimes, even though I try not to, and it still gives me chills. It was about 5 years ago when I was living in St. Louis. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship and was in the middle of figuring out what to do with my life. I was living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment in the central West End, which was a pretty nice area. The apartment building was old, like it had probably been built in the 1920s or something. It had that vintage charm with creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and radiators that clanged in the middle of the night. It was affordable though, and it was in a good location, so I didn't mind the quirks. I had just started a new job, working as a lab technician at a nearby hospital. The hours were long, and I often found myself getting home late, exhausted, and not really in the mood to do much of anything except crash on the couch and watch TV. I didn't have much of a social life back then. Most of my friends had either moved away or were busy with their own lives. So I spent a lot of time alone. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I got home around 9 p.m., made some dinner, and settled in for the night. It was a typical evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I had the TV on in the background, some mindless show that I wasn't really paying attention to, and I was scrolling through my phone, half distracted. I remember feeling kind of restless, like I wasn't tired enough to go to bed, but didn't have the energy to do anything productive either. Around 11 p.m. I decided to go for a walk. It wasn't something I usually did, but it was a nice night, and the streets around my apartment were usually quiet. The central West End had a mix of older, well-kept homes and newer apartment buildings, with tree-lined streets and a few small parks here and there. It was a safe area, for the most part, and I'd seen plenty of people out, walking their dogs or going for late-night jogs, so I didn't think anything of it. I put on my jacket and headed out the door. The air was cool, with a slight breeze that felt refreshing after being cooped up inside all day. I started walking down the sidewalk, heading toward a small park, about 5 blocks away. The streets were pretty empty, just the occasional car passing by. There were a few street lights, but they were spaced out, leaving stretches of the sidewalk in shadows. As I walked, I felt more relaxed. There's something calming about being out at night when everything is quiet. I passed a couple walking their dog and nodded as I walked by, but other than that, I didn't see anyone else. It was just me, the sound of my footsteps, and the faint hum of distant traffic. When I got to the park, I sat down on one of the benches near the entrance, looking out at the small pond in the center. The park was almost completely dark, with only a few dim lights scattered around, but I could make out the shapes of trees and the glimmer of the water in the moonlight. It was peaceful, and I sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet. After maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I decided to start heading back. As I got up from the bench and started walking back toward the entrance, I noticed something. A figure standing on the other side of the park, near one of the large oak trees. It was hard to see clearly in the dark, but the person was just standing there, facing my direction. At first, I didn't think much of it. People sometimes came to the park at night to clear their heads or get some fresh air, just like I had. But as I walked closer to the entrance, I glanced over again, and the person was still standing there. They hadn't moved. It was strange, but I figured maybe they were waiting for someone or just lost in thought. I picked up my pace, not wanting to linger in the park any longer than I had to. The quiet that had felt so peaceful before now felt a little unnerving. As I reached the sidewalk and started walking back toward my apartment, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone. That made me feel a little better. Like maybe I had just imagined it, or it wasn't anything to worry about. I walked a few more blocks, my apartment building coming into view in the distance. I was starting to feel more relaxed again, ready to get home and call it a night. But then, as I passed the side street, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The same figure standing at the end of the side street, just standing there, watching. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away, telling myself it wasn't the same person. It couldn't be. They were too far away to see clearly, and there was no way they could have gotten there so fast. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but I felt my pace quicken. I glanced over my shoulder again. The figure was still there, standing in the shadows, at the end of the side street. I turned onto my street and started walking faster. I wasn't running, but I was definitely on edge now. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My apartment building was just a few blocks away, and I could see the warm glow of the lights in the windows. As I reached the front of my building, I stopped and looked back one last time. The figure was gone. I stood there for a moment staring down the street, but there was nothing. No one. I let out a sigh of relief and unlocked the front door to my building. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and leaned against it for a moment, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I went upstairs to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sat down on the couch. The TV was still on, but I wasn't paying attention to it. I felt jittery, like I couldn't relax. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was no reason to be scared. But something about the way that person had been standing there, completely still, in the dark, it stuck with me. I decided to take a shower, hoping it would help me calm down. As I stood under the hot water, I started to feel a little better. The tension in my shoulders eased, and I started to convince myself that I had just overreacted. But then, as I was drying off, I heard a noise. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood there, listening, trying to convince myself it was just one of my neighbors coming home late. But the footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking up and down the hallway. I wrapped the towel around myself and crept over to the door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. I backed away from the door, feeling my stomach tighten with fear. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call someone, but who would I call? The police? What would I say? That I heard footsteps in the hallway? That wouldn't sound like much of an emergency. I stood there for a few more minutes, waiting, listening. But the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just one of my neighbors coming home late, or maybe someone walking past my door. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I went to work, went through the motions of my day, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. A few nights later, I was sitting on the couch, watching TV again, when I heard a noise outside my apartment door. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a faint scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked over to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening. The scraping sound was faint, but steady, moving slowly down the hallway. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to open the door, but I also couldn't just stand there, listening to that sound. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen, but everything went silent. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning I called the building manager to ask if there had been any strange activity in the building. He told me everything was fine, no complaints, no issues. I didn't mention the noises. I didn't want to sound crazy. I started avoiding being home at night. I'd stay late at work, go out with coworkers, do anything to keep myself from being alone in that apartment. Eventually, I moved out a few months later, not because of what happened, but because my lease was up and I found a better place. But I still think about it sometimes, about the figure in the park, about the noises in the hallway. I'll never know who or what it was, and maybe that's for the best. This happened about 3 years ago, and even though I've tried to forget about it, I still think about it more often than I'd like. It's the kind of thing that doesn't go away, even if you want it to. I've told bits and pieces to friends, but I've never really laid it all out because it feels too weird and I still don't know how to make sense of it. Back then, I was living in Chicago. I had just finished my graduate program and was working my first real job in the city. I was renting a tiny studio apartment in Uptown, one of those old brick buildings that looks like it was built in the 1920s. The place had character, but it was definitely showing its age. Creaky wooden floors, old plumbing that sometimes made weird noises, and a radiator that would bang loudly when it was warming up. It was the kind of place that looked charming at first glance, but had all these little annoyances you only discovered after living there for a while. I had gotten into the habit of running in the evenings after work. I wasn't much of a morning person, so running at night fit better into my schedule, and I liked the way the city felt when it was winding down. Uptown was pretty quiet in the evenings, at least in my part of the neighborhood. I would usually run up to Foster Beach and along the lakefront trail, which was usually empty by the time I got there. One night in late October, I left my apartment a little later than usual. It was a cool, crisp night, and I remember thinking it was the perfect weather for a run. Not too cold, not too warm. It was already dark, but the streetlights along the lakefront kept the path lit well enough. And I had been running this route for months, so I knew it well. I didn't feel nervous about being out there alone. I started my run from the corner of my block, heading east toward the lake. The streets were pretty empty, and as I made my way toward the park, the usual quiet settled in. I passed a few people walking their dogs, some cyclists heading home, but nothing out of the ordinary. When I reached the lakefront, I turned north toward Foster Beach. The trail was mostly empty, with just a few people scattered here and there. The only sounds were my footsteps and the distant hum of cars from Lakeshore Drive. As I ran, I zoned out, letting my mind wander, the way it usually did when I was in the middle of a long run. I passed the beach, the playground near the water, and kept going along the trail that curved through some low, rolling hills lined with trees. I loved that part of the path because it felt isolated, like a break from the city. The trees were thick enough to block out the view of the high-rises behind them, and the lake was just out of sight, so it felt like you were running through some hidden part of the city no one else knew about. I was maybe 3 miles into my run, starting to get into a rhythm, when I noticed something ahead of me. At first, it looked like a large pile of something lying on the path, maybe debris or trash someone had left behind. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't trash. It was a person. There was a man lying in the middle of the path, face down, completely still. I slowed to a stop a few feet away, staring. He wasn't moving at all, and for a second I thought maybe he was injured. My first instinct was to help, but something about the situation didn't feel right. I looked around, but the path was completely empty. No one else was around. I called out, asking if he was okay. No response. He didn't move. I took a cautious step closer, trying to see if he was breathing, but I couldn't tell. I stood there for a minute, debating whether to approach or just call 911. Something told me not to get too close. There was this heavy, unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach, like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Just as I was about to pull out my phone to call for help, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and, about 20 feet away, partially hidden in the shadows between 2 trees, I saw another person. They were standing completely still, watching me. The man on the ground suddenly didn't seem so helpless anymore. My heart started racing, and my mind was scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The person in the shadows didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there. I felt a surge of panic, like my body was screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, staring at the figure. The whole situation felt off, like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. Then, almost in slow motion, the person in the shadows took a step forward. Just one step. But it was enough to snap me out of my daze. I turned and bolted in the opposite direction, running faster than I've ever run in my life. My legs were burning and my chest tightened as I sprinted down the path, not daring to look back. I don't know how far I ran or how long I kept running, but eventually I reached the part of the trail where it opened up near the beach again, where there were more streetlights and a few people walking their dogs. I slowed down, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was following me, The trail behind me was empty. I kept walking, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing, but the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Who were those people? What had I walked into? I had no answers, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I considered going back to check if the man on the ground was still there, but the thought of returning to that part of the trail made my skin crawl. I decided to just go home. I didn't want to be out there any longer than I had to. When I finally got back to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the couch, still shaken. I couldn't get the image of the man on the ground out of my head, or the way the other person had just stood there, watching. It felt like I had narrowly avoided something, but I didn't know what. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, so I checked the local news, expecting to see something about an incident at the lakefront. Maybe someone had been attacked or injured, but there was nothing. No reports, no mention of anything unusual happening that night. It was like it hadn't even happened. For the next few weeks, I avoided running on the lakefront. I stuck to the busier streets and well-lit areas, but I still couldn't stop thinking about that night. I replayed it over and over in my head, wondering if I had overreacted, if it had just been some strange coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. A couple of months later, I finally worked up the courage to go back to the lakefront trail. It was late afternoon, still daylight, and the path was busy with runners, cyclists, and families walking along the water. I told myself it was safe, that whatever had happened that night was a one-time thing, just a weird fluke. As I ran, I reached the part of the trail where it curved through the trees, the spot where I had seen the man lying on the ground. My heart had started racing again as I approached, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing, just an empty path. I slowed down, glancing around, half expecting to see something, anything, but the trail was just as it always had been, quiet and empty. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe I was hoping for some kind of closure, something that would make sense of what had happened. But there was nothing. Just a quiet, empty trail. After that, I went back to running my usual route along the lakefront, but I was never able to fully relax there again. Every time I passed that spot, I felt a prickle of unease, like I was being reminded of something I couldn't quite grasp. I never found out who those people were or what was really going on that night, and maybe it's better that way. I've moved out of Chicago since then, but I still think about it sometimes. It's one of those things that sticks with you, even when you try to forget. And maybe that's the scariest part, not knowing. This happened a few years ago when I was still living in Boston. I had just finished my undergrad and moved into a small apartment in Jamaica Plain. It wasn't a great apartment, run down, old and pretty drafty in the winter, but it was cheap, and it was all I could afford while working my first job. The building itself was probably from the early 1900s, one of those narrow 3-story row houses you see all over that neighborhood. My apartment was on the second floor, and I lived alone. At the time, I was working long hours at a local coffee shop. I wasn't making much, but I liked my job, and it gave me enough flexibility to take freelance design gigs on the side. The hours were all over the place, though. Sometimes I'd open at 6 a.m., and other days I'd be closing late at night. That day, I was closing, so I got home pretty late, around 11 p.m. or so. It was mid-October, and the air had that cold bite that signals the start of real fall in New England. I remember being exhausted when I got home that night. My back was sore from being on my feet all day, and I just wanted to relax. I threw my bag on the couch, grabbed some leftovers from the fridge, and plopped down in front of the TV. It was a typical night. I wasn't expecting anything weird, which I guess is why what happened felt so out of nowhere. My apartment building wasn't huge, just 6 units, 2 on each floor, but it was old and you could hear pretty much everything that went on in the hallway or the apartments next door. I had gotten used to hearing my neighbors come and go or the sound of someone's footsteps on the stairs. Usually the noise wasn't bad enough to bother me. That night though, as I sat on the couch eating dinner, I heard something unusual. It started as a faint tapping sound, like someone lightly knocking on a door, but it was coming from somewhere above me. I figured it was the people on the 3rd floor moving around or maybe hanging something on the wall. The tapping was rhythmic, like it had a pattern, but it wasn't loud enough to be annoying. I didn't think much of it and went back to my TV show. After about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped, and I forgot all about it. I finished eating, cleaned up, and decided to head to bed. My bedroom was small, just big enough for my bed and a dresser, with a window that looked out onto the street. It was a quiet street, mostly residential, with cars lining both sides of the road and old trees with branches that hung low over the sidewalk. I had just crawled into bed when I heard the tapping again. This time it was louder and it sounded like it was coming from directly above me. I lay there for a minute, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe the people upstairs were hanging something heavy, or maybe it was just the pipes. Old buildings like this one made all kinds of strange noises. But then something changed. The tapping turned into more of a thumping, like someone was walking around up there with heavy boots. The sound moved across the ceiling, slow and deliberate. It wasn't frantic or random. It was methodical, like someone was pacing back and forth in a straight line. I sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps continued moving from one end of the room to the other. I checked my phone. It was past midnight now, way too late for someone to be making that much noise. I wondered if the people upstairs were rearranging furniture or doing something else loud, but it didn't make sense. Who would be moving furniture at this time of night? The footsteps kept going back and forth, slow and steady. I could hear the floor creaking above me with every step. I decided I'd give it a few more minutes, and if it didn't stop, I'd knock on their door and ask them to keep it down. After another 5 minutes, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I waited, half expecting them to start again, but everything went quiet. I let out a sigh of relief, figuring they had finally called it a night, and I lay back down, pulling the covers up and trying to relax. But then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, there was a loud bang. It came from the ceiling again, directly above my bed. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped. My heart jumped, and I stared up at the ceiling, wondering what the hell was going on up there. The building was old, sure, but the walls were thick enough that I shouldn't have been hearing this much noise. I got out of bed and went to the window. I could see the lights from the 3rd floor apartment were on, casting a dim glow across the street below. I debated whether or not to go upstairs and knock on their door, but I didn't want to seem like the kind of neighbor who complains about every little thing. Maybe it was just a one-time thing and they'd settle down. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I heard something else. A faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor above me. The noise was soft, barely audible, but it made my skin crawl. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, threw on a hoodie, and decided to go upstairs and talk to whoever was making the noise. I grabbed my keys and headed out into the hallway. The lights in the hall were dim, and the air felt colder than usual. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a second, listening, but everything was quiet now. No footsteps, no thumping, just silence. I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the railing. When I reached the third floor, I hesitated. The door to the apartment above mine was slightly ajar. I could see a faint light coming from inside, flickering like the glow of a TV or a lamp. I waited for a moment, listening, but I didn't hear anything. No voices, no footsteps, just that faint flicker of light. I knocked on the door gently at first, then a little louder. No response. I knocked again, but still nothing. My heart started to race. I didn't want to intrude, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I pushed the door open a little more, just enough to peek inside. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow from a small TV in the corner of the living room. The furniture was sparse, just a couch, a coffee table, and a few boxes scattered around the floor. There were no signs of anyone being there. I called out asking if anyone was home, but the apartment was empty. I stood there for a minute trying to decide what to do. Maybe the noise had been coming from another apartment, or maybe the people who lived here had gone out and left the TV on. But something about the scene didn't feel right. The air in the apartment was stale, like no one had been there for a while. I backed out of the doorway and headed back downstairs, my mind racing. As soon as I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. I crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about the empty apartment, the strange noises, and the open door. The next morning I was still feeling uneasy about what had happened, so I decided to ask my landlord if the people on the third floor had moved out. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I needed to know if anyone was living up there. When I called my landlord, she seemed confused. She told me that the apartment on the third floor had been vacant for months. No one had lived there since the last tenant moved out over the summer. She said it was scheduled to be renovated soon, but as far as she knew, no one had been in the building. My stomach dropped. I told her about the noises I had heard the night before, and she sounded concerned. She said she'd come by later that day to check it out, but I could tell she didn't really believe me. After I hung up, I sat on my couch, trying to make sense of everything. I couldn't explain it. I had heard the footsteps, the thumping, the scraping. It had been so clear, so real. But if no one was living in the apartment above me, where had the noise come from? Later that afternoon, my landlord came by with a maintenance guy to check the third floor apartment. I didn't go with them, but after about an hour, they knocked on my door. She told me they hadn't found anything unusual. The apartment was empty, just like I had seen the night before. There were no signs of anyone being there, and nothing seemed out of place. I tried to forget about it after that. I convinced myself it had just been the old building, making noises, or maybe someone else in the building, moving around and the sound carrying weirdly through the walls. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few weeks later, I moved out of that apartment. I had gotten a new job that paid better, and I found a place in a newer building on the other side of the city. I told myself that it was time for a change, but part of me just didn't want to stay in that building any longer. I still think about those noises sometimes. I've tried to rationalize it, but no matter how much I tell myself it was nothing, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the old building really was settling in some strange way. But part of me wonders if there was something else. Something I'll never fully understand. A couple of years ago, I moved from Los Angeles to Portland, Oregon. I was trying to leave the city life behind and start fresh in a quieter place. I didn't know many people in Portland, but I liked that. It felt like a chance to get away from the noise and chaos of LA and have some time to myself. I found a small house to rent in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The house was nothing special, just a little two-bedroom place with a small yard, tucked into a corner of a dead-end street. There was a thick patch of woods behind the house, which was one of the things that drew me to it. It felt secluded, like my own little piece of solitude. It was still only a 20-minute drive to downtown. I moved in at the beginning of fall, when the days were getting shorter and the weather was cooling down. It was a nice change from the constant sun of LA, and I liked the quiet evenings that came with it. Most of the houses in my neighborhood were older, like mine, but well kept. It was the kind of place where you would see people walking their dogs or sitting on their porches in the evenings, but everyone mostly kept to themselves. After I settled in, I started developing a routine. I'd spend my mornings working from home, go for walks around the neighborhood in the afternoons, and unwind in the evenings with a book or a movie. It was simple, and I liked the peace of it. One weekend, I decided to explore the woods behind my house. I'd been meaning to check them out for a while, but with moving in and getting adjusted to my new job, I hadn't had the chance. The trees were thick, and the woods stretched out for what looked like miles behind the house. There was no official trail, but there were enough gaps between the trees that I could make my way through easily enough. It was a chilly Saturday morning when I finally decided to go. I put on a jacket and boots, grabbed my phone, and headed out the back door. The air was crisp, and there was that damp, earthy smell you get in the Pacific Northwest after it rains. I followed a narrow path that had been worn into the ground by years of use, though it wasn't a well-traveled path by any means. The trees closed in around me as I walked, sounds of the neighborhood fading away behind me. At first, it was nice, peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional bird in the trees. I walked for about half an hour, weaving my way deeper into the woods. I wasn't in a hurry, just enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. The trees were taller than I'd expected, and the further I went, the denser the woods seemed to get. After a while, I realized I hadn't seen or heard anything for a bit. Not a bird, not a squirrel, nothing. The woods were completely silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost like it's pressing down on you. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I'd just gone deeper than I realized, and there weren't many animals around. But the silence was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. I kept walking, figuring I'd head back soon. I wasn't too worried about getting lost because I'd been paying attention to where I was going, making sure I could follow the path back. But after another 10 minutes or so, I came to a spot where the trees thinned out, and I found myself standing in front of a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a cabin. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a shed, but it was old. Really old. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in places. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I hadn't expected to find anything like this back here, and for a second, I just stood there staring at it. I debated whether or not to get closer. On one hand, it was probably just some old hunting cabin or something, left behind by whoever used to own the land. On the other hand, it was weird. I hadn't seen any sign of people back here, no other houses, no trails, nothing. And the cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward the cabin, my boots crunching on the dead leaves. The air felt even colder now, and the silence was almost oppressive. When I got closer, I could see that the door to the cabin was slightly ajar, hanging crooked on its rusted hinges. I stopped in front of the door, debating whether to go inside. It felt wrong to be there, like I was trespassing, but at the same time I wanted to see what was inside. I pushed the door open with one hand and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the clearing. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled musty, like wet wood and decay. There wasn't much to see, just an old wooden table, a couple of broken chairs, and a pile of rotting blankets in one corner. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the walls were lined with shelves that were empty except for a few rusted tools. I stepped inside, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. The place felt forgotten, like no one had set foot in it for years. I walked around the small space, looking at the shelves and the table, but there wasn't much to see. Just an old cabin in the middle of the woods. But then, as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. In the corner, behind the pile of rotting blankets, there was a small door. It was barely noticeable, almost like it had been hidden on purpose. It was low to the ground, no more than 3 feet tall, and looked like it led to a crawl space, or maybe a cellar. I crouched down, curious. The door was old and warped, the wood darkened with age, but there was no lock. I reached out and pulled it open. The hinges groaned, and a cold draft hit me as the door swung open, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down into darkness. I didn't have a flashlight with me, just the light from my phone, but I leaned forward and shined it down the stairs. The steps were made of the same old wood as the rest of the cabin, and they led down into what looked like a small basement. I couldn't see the bottom from where I was standing, but I could make out the outline of what looked like another room down there. Something about the whole thing felt off. The cabin itself was strange enough, but this hidden basement didn't make any sense. Why would someone go to the trouble of building a basement this far out in the woods? And why hide it behind a door like that? I thought about going down to check it out, but something in my gut told me not to. The air coming from the basement was colder than the air outside, and it smelled damp and rotten, like something was decaying down there. I stood up, closed the door, and backed away from the cabin. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to know. I turned and walked quickly back the way I had come, retracing my steps through the woods. The silence was even more noticeable now, like the whole forest was holding its breath. By the time I got back to my house, it was late afternoon, and the sky was starting to darken. I went inside, locked the door, and sat down on the couch, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I told myself it was just an old, forgotten building, but something about it kept bothering me. The hidden basement, the cold air, the silence in the woods. It didn't feel right. A week later, I decided to go back. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was nothing, that I had just let my imagination get the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight this time and headed back into the woods. The trail felt different this time. I didn't hear any birds, and the trees seemed closer, more oppressive. I kept walking though, determined to find the cabin again. After about 30 minutes, I reached the clearing. But the cabin was gone. I stood there staring at the empty clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin had been right here, I was sure of it. But now, there was nothing. Just an empty patch of dirt and leaves, like the cabin had never existed. I walked around the clearing looking for any sign of the building, but there was nothing. No broken boards, no old tools, no door to a hidden basement. Just empty space. I don't know what happened that day or if I somehow wandered off the trail and ended up in a different part of the woods, but I never went back to look for the cabin again. After that, I stopped exploring the woods. Something about that place felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. I stayed in the house for another 6 months before moving back to LA. I never told anyone about the cabin. I figured no one would believe me anyway. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those stairs leading down into the dark, and I wonder what would have happened if I had gone down there. I guess I'll never know.